Okay, well, hello, everybody. Somebody comment that I start all of my talks with, okay. I make an effort to not say okay, but evidently I just did it. So I'm sure that person is going to send me an email and complain again, but such is life. Well, for those of you who know me, you know who I am. I'm Ronald Brown. I teach history, political science at Touro College, world religions at the Unification Theological Seminary. And under these wonderful days of pandemic, I've been giving a whole series of Zoom talks, which are later posted on YouTube, on all kinds of different topics. So welcome once again to another exciting talk. And this is the series on the great cities of the world. Today, our topic is Tel Aviv, the city of the Jewish spring. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have been to Tel Aviv. In fact, someone just mentioned that they had been there. So recently, it's a great city, but like every city, it has its own unique history. Why was it established? It's not an ancient city like Rome or Tel Aviv or like Rome or Jerusalem or Cairo. It is a new city. And it has a very, very heavy ideological content. So let's get going. Once again, there's the outline. We'll talk about the person who came up with the idea for Tel Aviv, and that was Theodore Herzl, considered the father of modern political Zionism. Number two will be the background to the finding of Tel Aviv, the decline of the great European empires, and the fact that this decline of the Russian, the German, and the Austro-Hungarian and the Turkish empires had on the Jews of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Third will be what Tel Aviv was supposed to be, the homeland of the new Jew, a new person, a new individual. Number four is going to be Tel Aviv as the proof of Jewish nationalism, that the Jews are a people, a nation, just like everybody else. And finally, my favorite place in Tel Aviv is Dizengoff, which you all know, named after one of the very first mayors of Tel Aviv. So let's get going. Well, to begin, Theodore Herzl, as you all know, in Jerusalem, there's Har Herzl and Mount Herzl and Herzl Street, and every city in Israel has a Herzl Street or square or whatnot. Well, in 1896, he wrote his famous book called Der Judenstaat, Versuch einer modernen Lösung der Judenfrage, or you translate it as a Jewish state toward a modern solution to the Jewish question. And here we see Theodore Herzl, who was an Austrian journalist who covered trials in Europe and was a journalist traveling around France and Russia and every place else. So he was of the upper class Jewish population of Vienna, spoke languages, was highly educated, highly assimilated. In fact, he was about the only person in his family who ended up remaining Jewish. Everybody else assimilated completely and became Christian or passed from being a non-practicing Jew to being a non-practicing Catholic or Lutheran. So this is where the history of Tel Aviv actually begins. Now, what was the Jewish question as Theodore Herzl understood it? Well, for him, Jewish history, modern Jewish history, began with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD by the Romans. The Jews had risen in revolt, wanted to get their ancient independence back. The Romans came in, conquered the country again, destroyed Jerusalem, and on the right you see the famous stone carving, which is still in Rome today, showing the victorious Roman soldiers returning to Rome, carrying the temple menorah and the temple treasures to Rome, where they disappeared. Now, of course, nobody knows what happened to the Ark of the Covenant and the menorah and all the other temple treasures. That is probably topic of another PowerPoint presentation, whatever happened to all this. But this is where modern Jewish history began for Theodore Herzl. This is commonly called the Diaspora. Now, in the Diaspora, with the temple gone, with the temple priests gone, with Jerusalem gone, a new kind of Judaism flourished in the Diaspora. This is the golden age of synagogue Judaism. No more temples and animal sacrifices and priests. There were rabbis. Now, on the right, you see the two chief rabbis in Israel. There's one for the Sephardic Jews of the Mediterranean basin, and one for the Ashkenazi Jews of Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. They generally hate each other, have different ways of celebrating their rituals, don't get along very well, but this is the triumph of what we call synagogue Judaism over temple Judaism. Now, synagogue Judaism was marked by reading of the Torah. By the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, most of the Torah and the Jewish Bible, so-called Old Testament, had actually been written down and a more uniform text was accepted. Hebrew was a dead language. Only the rabbis could read Hebrew. The Aramaic was the language of the Jews in 70 AD, but they still kept Hebrew as their sacred language. Traditions were very important for the Jews. Marriage, how they lived, the holidays, Passover plate, kosher food, the whole array of laws were what kept the Jews together. So they were largely a religious community scattered from Russia to Portugal, to India, and eventually to Latin America and places like Singapore and Hong Kong. So in the diaspora, Judaism became uniquely a religion. Jews had their own language, whether it was Ladino for the Sephardics or Yiddish for the Ashkenazi Jews. They developed their way of dress. You see the long black coats, which was the dress of Polish aristocrats. Somewhere in Russia, they picked up the big woolly hats. And the Jews lived in ghettos. In the bottom left, you see the Lower East Side. So whether the Jews were forced to live in ghettos in Eastern Europe, the so-called Pale of Settlements, or upon arrival in America, they chose to recreate the Jewish ghettos, such as the Lower East Side, or today in Brooklyn or in upstate New York. Judaism became a religious community. Now, there was a real conflict in the diaspora between the Eastern European Jews, and the map on the left, it shows the Pale of Settlements, where Jews of the Russian Empire were required to live. Certain cities there were completely Jewish cities. A lot of the religious sects, such as the Hasidic groups, emerged from there. And they were, once again, a religious community. The rabbis were the head of the communities. But in Western Europe, you had a different kind of diaspora Judaism, and these were the assimilated Jews. On the right, we see the main synagogue in Berlin. These were Reform assimilated Jews. These were the sophisticated Jews who went to the opera, who quoted Goethe, who listened to Handel, who played the piano and violin, were university professors, members of the federal parliament, or the government parliaments in the various Germanic states and in Austria. So the diaspora Judaism still focused around religion. It was a religious community. In fact, when you say who is a Jew today, the big debate, well, most people would say that Jews are a religious community. This is how Theodore Herzl viewed the status of the Jews following the destruction of the state of Israel and Jerusalem in 70 AD. The diaspora spread around the world, synagogues and rabbis. Hebrew was a dead language. You either assimilated and became ultra-modern, even married into Christian families, or you were an Eastern European Orthodox ghetto Jew. Well, this was the situation, according to Herzl, which existed up until the arrival of World War I. We look at the map, we see Europe on the verge of World War I. The great Russian Empire, which included not just Russia as we know it, but the bulk of the Jews of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. German Empire include a big chunk of Poland, which was heavily populated by Jews. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the great Jewish communities of Hungary, of the Czechs and the Slovaks, and even Galicia, southern Poland, had a very large Jewish community. Well, the Jews managed to survive in these various empires and reached accommodation with the governments. In Germany, most of them were highly assimilated Reform Jews who you couldn't distinguish on the street. In the Russian Empire, they had their pale of settlement. A few of the wealthy ones got the right to live in Moscow or St. Petersburg. In Austria, Vienna had an ever-growing large number of Jews who migrated to the cities of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. Well, following and just before World War I, which is 1914 to 1918, there was the rise of nationalism. In the Russian Empire, Poland had never accepted its status as a part of the Russian Empire. They clung to their language, they clung to their traditions, and most of all, they clung to their Roman Catholicism, no matter what the Tsar in distant Moscow said. The same thing with Finland. They remained fiercely Lutheran and proud of their Finnish culture. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were either Lutheran or Catholic and never loved the Russians, and they don't until today. Armenia and Georgia, which are in the map today, remained fiercely Orthodox, but preserved their language and culture. And of course, there was the huge Jewish population in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, the famous Bukharian Jews who have migrated in mass 10 streets away from where I live at Forest Hills. In the late 1800s, there was a rise of nationalism in the Russian Empire. Also in the Austrian Empire, more and more Hungarians and Czechs and my grandfather's family from Slovakia, Italians, Romanians, Croatians, and Slovenians said, why should we be part of the Austrian Empire? We are not Austrians. We are Hungarians and speak Hungarian. We are Italians and speak Italians. We are Romanians in Transylvania and are Orthodox Christians. And so you had this rise of nationalism in the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and even in the German Empire. The Polish part started rising in revolt. The northernmost part of the country Large numbers of people from Denmark were not happy being forced into the German Empire. And of course, my grandfather's family from Alsace-Lorraine had been for centuries part of France, were then occupied by Germany, and were sort of eager to get some type of national autonomy. Well, in this rise of nationalism in Eastern and Western Europe, Poland was a country, Hungary was a country, Slovakia was a country, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Okay, these were countries which had a long history. But scattered throughout these three empires were millions of Jews. They had no compact area that they could carve out and say, this is going to be an independent Jewish country. They were a minority wherever they lived. And if you look at the map, you'll see huge numbers. For example, 3 million Jews in Poland, over 1 million in Russia and the Soviet Union, 500,000 in Hungary, 500,000 just in Austria itself, 78,000 in Bohemia and Moravia. So the Jews were a minority. So while the Poles and the Slovaks, the Hungarians and the Romanians and Lithuanians were demanding independence and struggling for it, the Jews saw nothing but disaster in their future. And this is precisely what happened, according to Herzl. After World War I, the Russian Empire collapsed and it became the USSR. The German Empire collapsed and it became the Weimar Republic. Austria was brutally carved up into a new state called Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, a polyglot country of Yugoslavia, and a little truncated Austria with Vienna as its capital. But if you look closely at that map, you don't see any Jewish enclaves. And it got even worse for the Jews in Eastern Europe, because when Poland got its independence, it was definitely not interested in protecting its minorities. For centuries, Poland had been occupied by either Germany, Austria, or Russia. And when they got their independence again, similar to, you see the map of Poland there, not where Poland is today very much, but they got a new country. They said, finally, we have independence and we are going to restore our ancient culture. The Czechs did the same thing. The Hungarians, the Romanians, and the Yugoslavs did the same thing, as well as Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. There was an outbreak of fierce nationalism. Well, of course, who was going to suffer the most? Of course, the Jews. Once again, not in one compact area that could declare its independence. They became the victim of unbelievable persecution. Now, of course, in the new Soviet Union that emerged, religion across the board was being persecuted. So the Jews, especially the Orthodox Jews who lived in their ghettos, suddenly had the Soviet troops coming in, shutting down Yiddish language yeshivas, shutting down synagogues and taking rabbis off to Siberia, forcing the young men into the army, forcing people to dress like everybody else. Well, the League of Nations tried to protect the Jewish minority and other minorities in Eastern Europe. When Poland became independent, it signed a treaty with the League of Nations guaranteeing total religious freedom, freedom of language, keep your Yiddish language yeshivas, Synagogues could be built and opened and run independently. The courts, you had your Jewish ritual courts. The Jews were given the right to vote. The ancient lands, they were given ownership documents. They were allowed to vote and to be elected to public office. They had equality before the law. I shouldn't say they had. They were guaranteed by the treaty. No forced conversions, the right to plebiscites. Well, of course, the Jews were not very welcome in Poland. Finally, Poland was a new country after the war. It was going back to Holy Mother, the Roman Catholic Church. It was going back to the Polish language, no more German or Russian language newspapers. Everything was going to be in Polish. So either become a Pole or get out. And this was the case in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, down into Yugoslavia. Well, we know how this all ended. The rise of Hitler, the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed. The few refugees who managed to survive either came to the United States or were given refuge in the British-controlled protectorate of Palestine. Well, the inflow of Jews from Eastern Europe, the survivors of the Holocaust, started trickling into Palestine. And on the 14th of May, 1948, the state of Israel declared its independence. So Theodore Herzl's theory, as he put it in The Jewish State, was Jews would never be accepted as a minority living in the diaspora. Persecution was going to be their lot. And the only place they would find security was when they had their own state. So Theodore Herzl's predictions, his view of history, proved to be correct. Well, Theodore Herzl went even further. He wasn't just not talking about bringing a bunch of Jews and making a country like everybody else had, but it involved a lot more. For firstly, in his book, The Jewish State, he clearly stated Jews are a national group. Like Americans, like Koreans, like Chinese, like Lithuanians, like Germans, they are a nationality. They are not a religion. So according to Herzl, you could be a Catholic Jew, you could be a Protestant Jew. What religion you practice for Herzl was totally irrelevant. His own children ended up intermarrying with Christians, became Catholics, but they still consider themselves of the Jewish nationality. In addition to defining the Jews as a national group, he said, well, if you're a national group, you have to have a national language. Koreans have Korean, Japanese have Japanese, the British have English. So central to Theodore Herzl's program for establishing a Jewish state was restore the national language. Ben Yehuda, famous street in Tel Aviv, every city in Israel has a Ben Yehuda street, they claim was the first one to speak a restored Hebrew as his official mother tongue. Secondly, they had to get a territory. In the diaspora, they were scattered everywhere. So he called for the ingathering of the Jews into one place. Well, he at one time considered a colony in Australia or Africa, but the majority of the Jews said, no, we have an ancient homeland, and that is the land of Israel. And restore national pride, study Jewish history, not as a ghetto people practicing ancient weird rituals of funny clothes and funny food and all kinds of other things, but celebrate Solomon, celebrate King David, celebrate Joshua, the great military heroes of the Jewish nation, not rabbis and philosophers and thinkers, but modern people. And he said, the end of the diaspora is imminent. The Jews will see the wisdom of establishing a Jewish state, and they will come to this new state. So, new Jew was his key word. Forget the past and enter into the future. Well, the whole issue of who is a Jew, whether it's a religion, whether it's an ethnic group, whether it's a culture, is still, as the book on the left said, a very complex question. But the goal of Zionism, the goal of Theodore Herzl, and the goal of Tel Aviv was to create a homeland for this new Jewish national revival. Now, a definite parallel was drawn between the African Americans in the United States and Theodore Herzl, who followed very closely what was going on in the United States. And in Harlem, during the Harlem Renaissance and before, you had books such as the survey graphic on the left, which said Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. Gather the Black people of America into one mega city, create a new person. A person who was no longer a slave, who was no longer a persecuted minority. The poet Alan Locke, the new Negro, an interpretation. The new Negro for a new century, Booker T. Washington. So here again, Theodore Herzl was very much like other minority groups which sought to forget centuries of history, return to an ancient glorious history, and embark on a new future. It's as if he had taken a little bottle of whiteout and wiped out everything in Jewish history from 70 AD until the founding of Tel Aviv. Now, the period after World War I, which in Germany was the glorious Weimar Republic. In the United States, it was the roaring 20s, the decade that changed America. Women's liberation, women eventually getting the right to vote. I mean, look at these women. This is not your Victorian woman with her hair up in pins and her corset around her waist and her dress down to her ankles. This was a new America which emerged in the 1920s. Music, art, dance, literature, a booming middle class. The same thing inspired the Soviet Revolution. This was an experiment creating the new man of the future. Russia was going to lead the world into the promised land, a new golden age. Well, needless to say, Theodore Herzl's vision, first of gathering the Jews into one country, was soundly condemned by the religious Jews. They firmly believed that 70 AD happened because the Jews had stopped worshiping their God in the correct way, and it was punishment for their evil sins and bad way of living. And the Orthodox Jews said, we will only be ushered back to our holy land when God has forgiven us and sent the Messiah to lead us back to our country. So there was severe Orthodox Jewish immigration to Israel and the establishment of a heretical state, as they called it. The Reformed Jews in America, in the famous Pittsburgh Platform of right after the Civil War, clearly stated, we are no longer a nation, we are a religious community. We don't expect to return to Palestine. We don't expect to build a temple and start sacrificing animals. And we don't plan for the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So Theodore Herzl's plan for a Jewish state in Palestine had more opposition from Jews than it did from non-Jews. Well, that's where Tel Aviv comes into the picture. Tel Aviv is going to be the proof that Theodore Herzl's vision of a new Jew, of Jews as a nationality, was correct. The first settlements, what eventually became known as Tel Aviv, were already begun in 1887. They were not a city. These settlements were built around the Palestinian city of Jaffa, which was the main city today just south of Tel Aviv. So the Jews started building settlements, and you can see the picture on the right with the on the left with the Mediterranean in the distance, and small houses, people migrating from around the world, gradually learning the new language of modern day Hebrew, gradually expanding. 1921, the area which is now Tel Aviv got the status of a township. Now, this was granted by the British, who then ruled Palestine. By 1934, Tel Aviv was an independent city. Now, as you can see on the picture on the right, I mean, the roads were barely paved. They were mainly just sand. They did have electricity in some of the wealthy houses. There were some cars. You can see the ruts in the street, but it was a growing city. Now, very important here, Theodore Herzl totally ignored Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the place where the Orthodox Jews were the largest Jewish population. In the 1930s and 40s, Jerusalem was still a Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian city, but the Jews were largely in Mea Shearim and were predominantly Orthodox. And this was the exact opposite of what Theodore Herzl wanted to create. The Orthodox Jews, and many until today, refused to speak modern Hebrew as an abomination in the sight of God. It was to be a secular city. Ben-Gurion is alleged to have made the comment. He was the first prime minister of independent Israel. He said, when Israel has Hebrew-speaking prostitutes walking the streets of Tel Aviv, then we will be a nation just like all the others. So this was the age of Herzl. This was the age of Ben-Gurion. And this was the new Jew. Now, what was the new Jew? Not just living in Tel Aviv, but speaking a modernized version of Hebrew. They were viciously anti-religious, meaning synagogue reminded them of the diaspora. When the rabbis with their beards and their coats and everything sitting in a musty room filled with tea and cigarettes, this reminded them of the ghetto. Herzl said, abolish the synagogue, take the kids, send them to university, become professors, become generals, become farmers, found factories. This is what the modern Jewish state is all about. It was also socialist. Don't forget that the first group of Jews, the first Aliyah, came predominantly from Eastern Europe. They considered rabbis and synagogues and all these rules and stuff as an impediment to social betterment, to human progress. It was secular. For the first several decades, Tel Aviv did not have a synagogue. In fact, I go to visit very often a kibbutz in North Israel, not far from Afula. I shouldn't mention the name, but it is one of the largest and richest kibbutzim in Israel. It has thousands of residents sprawled over a huge area. They don't even have a synagogue. Now, according to Israeli law, if you're Jews, you have to be married by an Orthodox rabbi. So they have a rent-a-rabbi in Jerusalem who, when somebody on the kibbutz has to get married, they send him a letter and the papers, he signs them, and he gets a nice check and signs all the papers, and it's legal. Also, labor Zionism, the Labor Party, which ruled Israel until the rise of Menachem Begin, was fiercely nationalistic. As you can see from the parade at the bottom, you have not only the Israeli flag, but you have the red flags of socialism. So Herzl had a clear idea of what the Jewish state was going to be, and Tel Aviv was his pride and joy. It was proof that his vision of a secular, non-religious, nationalistic state would succeed. Now, anybody who was born in Israel is called in Israel a Sabra. Now, most people don't know what a Sabra is, but it's called a prickly pear cactus. As you can see on the left, those little orange things are really very, very sweet. But be careful because they have a very hard seed inside, and many a tourist has smashed a tooth on them. But they make a great alcoholic beverage. But these are the Sabras. The new Israelis and the new immigrants migrating to Israel were immediately informed that they were members of the new Jews. Go to a kibbutz, plant orange groves surrounding Tel Aviv, build factories, build schools, build universities. Don't go off into some synagogue and moan and groan in a dead language. Speak modern Hebrew, get with it. And so you see on the right, one of the big celebrations of Israeli independence going through. You don't see any religious Jews at all. And in fact, religious Jews were not welcome in the city of Tel Aviv. So the model for the new Tel Aviv was going to be the United States, Great Britain. It was going to be Western Europe with a heavy tinge of socialism, but not communism, but socialism. And so this was the Labor Party, and Tel Aviv was their pride and joy. This was the new Jew, the modern Jew. Now, as part of their westernization, drag the Jews kicking and screaming out of their Yiddish-speaking ghetto ruled by rabbis and what they considered superstition, drag them into the modern world. One of the proudest institutions that they built in Tel Aviv was the Habima Theater in 1912. And the poster on the right, Brothers Karamazov by Dostoyevsky, Hebrew translation. And you can imagine in 1912, Hebrew was still the second language of most of the people who would go to the theater. But they were very proud that they were seeing the best of world literature. Israel, the new Jew, was part of the modern world. They knew Shakespeare, they knew Dostoyevsky, They knew the great writers of Europe. The Palestine Symphony Orchestra, 1936, today the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. This drew on some of the greatest musicians of the world. The picture on the left I found, it said, "To Leonard Bernstein, as a token of appreciation and gratitude from the members of the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra." Composers, musicians, singers would come and perform in the symphony orchestra. On the right, we see the modern building of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. Once again, Tel Aviv was going to be right up there with London and Paris and Berlin and Vienna and Milan in the great music venues of the world. This was no ghetto country he was building. It was going to be part of the modern world. And Tel Aviv until today is very proud that it is in the vanguard of world culture. Tel Aviv Pride 2020. I mean, this is a modern world. So Tel Aviv is not only part of the Silicon Valley of Israel, the stock market is there, but also liberation, where Jews are now part of the modern world. If you have a gay pride parade in Jerusalem, it is usually attacked and stoned by the Orthodox Jews. I mean, it is Tel Aviv where this type of thing happens. Now, the main drag of Tel Aviv, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is the famous Dizengoff, beginning at Dizengoff Circle. And Dizengoff was one of the very early, maybe even the first mayor of Tel Aviv. Once again, one of these Eastern European secular Jews who came over and participated in building a modern city. In fact, many people call it Marseille, as in France, in Palestine, in Israel. Dizengoff Street, which goes from Dizengoff Circle, is the nightlife of the city, filled with bars, with restaurants, with bookstores, with everything that you would expect in any ultra-modern city. And once again, if you do see one or two yarmulkes around there, that is the exception. And so this is really dragging, kicking, and screaming, as Herzl said, dragging Orthodox Jews, religious Jews into the modern world. Judaism is a nationality, just like any other. Now, as Tel Aviv was being built in the 20s especially, which was a golden age under British mandate, Britain supported the establishment of a Jewish state, and it permitted large immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. Well, many German Jews, Austrian, Czech Jews migrated, and there were various members of the famous German Bauhaus architectural movement that flourished in Germany. And they really wanted to make Tel Aviv a Berlin on the Mediterranean. And the Bauhaus architecture was absolutely breathtaking. As you walk up and down Dizengoff, you see the rejection of square buildings with the emphasis on balconies, because when you live in Tel Aviv in the age of before air conditioning, the balcony and the roof deck was heaven. And even the building on the right, which is a relatively modern building with a brand new addition on the roof for a discotheque, still they maintain the curves, getting rid of the square box. Very much similar to Frank Lloyd Wright and his famous Guggenheim Museum, where he said, I will never build any more buildings that have a square room in them. He said, with concrete and steel, we are not locked into square buildings and square rooms anymore. I love the building on the bottom left. It sort of reminds you of the Flatiron Building, the intersection of two streets coming up to a point. Could you imagine living there and having one of these magnificent balconies overlooking two separate streets? Other buildings, balconies, the private house in the middle on the bottom, because a lot of wealthy Jews built houses there. A lot of American Jews supported Zionism. They didn't want to live there, but they would build a house there and they would say, that is my Tel Aviv address. And in fact, Zionist architecture became a rather distinctive style of architecture. It was not looking to the ancient Middle East. It was not looking to something before the time of David and Solomon. It was not looking to ancient Egypt or Babylon. It was looking to modern Europe and America for its architectural inspiration. The streets were long, wide, covered with trees, parks everywhere. It was clearly a city of the future. In 1953, Tel Aviv University was built. Once again, that could be almost any modern American university setting. Emphasis on sciences, on all the modern topics, whereas other universities were part of a past. Still, the University of Tel Aviv, unlike the University of Jerusalem, which was much older, the Tel Aviv University was going to be an outward, forward-looking university, building a new modern country. Now, in 1926, there was a synagogue built, and this is Beit Knesset HaGadol, the great synagogue of Tel Aviv. On the left, you can see it was a traditional style with the dome, the cement, very Middle Eastern, very synagogue looking. Well, in 1970, it was remodeled and this rather odd-looking grill was put around it to make it look more modern. But there were Orthodox Jews who started settling north of Tel Aviv and started building their own settlements. Now, south of Tel Aviv, if you look on the map, you see the Carmel Market, the Great Synagogue, you see Rothschild Boulevard. Well, at the bottom of the picture, you see Jaffa. Jaffa was a Muslim and Christian city. In fact, for almost a century, Tel Aviv, until it became a separate city, was considered the northern suburbs of Jaffa. It is still a city filled with convents and mosques and the famous bell tower on the right. During the Independence War, almost the entire population of about 60,000 people was convinced that it is better for them to leave. Now, Israeli historians say they left of their own free will. But following the mass slaughter of Palestinians by Menachem Begin in Deir Yassin and in other cities on the coast, the people of Jaffa felt that if they had a choice, they could either stay and die or they could leave. So today, there are almost just a couple thousand Christians and Muslims left in Jaffa, and it has become a very fashionable, very expensive place for Jews. In fact, the two cities are now merged. The city is called Tel Aviv Jaffa. The settlement of Bnei Brak was built near Tel Aviv, but sort of a recreation of an Orthodox ghetto that the Jews from Eastern Europe had. They wanted to avoid the temptations of Tel Aviv, but yet they were migrating to Palestine and later to the state of Israel. So until today, Bnei Brak is a city which is overwhelmingly Orthodox Jewish. You see how it looked in the 1920s when it was first being built. I mean, you see camels walking around because it was the major means of transportation. Today, it is a major thriving city, as you can see from the yeshiva on the right. The stark difference between Tel Aviv and Bnei Brak couldn't be more evident. Saturday in Tel Aviv is boom time. The beaches are packed. Everybody is out having great fun. You go to Bnei Brak, the streets are closed. Now, Tel Aviv, though, does accommodate the religious. In front of the Hilton Hotel, which overlooks the Mediterranean, are the famous beaches of Tel Aviv. Well, the beaches are clearly delineated. You have the public beach of Tel Aviv, where anything goes. You'll see topless women, men in Speedo bathing suits, and nobody really cares. Then there's a barrier. Then you will have a religious area for religious Jewish families. Then you go a little bit further and another barrier, and there is a beach for the gays and lesbians. Then you go a little bit further, there's a barrier, and that's where the Palestinians can go to the beach. And so, I mean, Tel Aviv is very accommodating on that, but it still remains its secular city, the new Jew, not the old Jew of the ghetto. So it brings us to the end. On the picture on the right, you probably don't recognize me, but that's me when I lived in Jerusalem. I lived in Jerusalem for 5 years. I did my first MA at the Hebrew University, and I would go to Tel Aviv all the time. I mean, you go to the bus station, and even on the Sabbath, you would just get up early in the morning on Saturday and catch what they called a shirut, which is like a collective taxi. And in an hour and a half, you'd be down in Tel Aviv. They'd drop you off in Dizengoff, and you would party and go to the beach and everything. I always went to for the high holidays. I always went to Tel Aviv with my friends, and then back to Jerusalem to do my thesis. And on the left, that's sort of what I look like today. So you can see I've aged pretty well. So if anybody has any questions or comments or any observations they'd like to share with me, feel free to send me an email at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com, and I will get right back to you. So thank you very much for joining me in this wonderful visit to one of the fascinating cities of the world, Tel Aviv.